All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is not miraculous healing. This is unto maturity. And so hopefully you're here because you want to be mature. That's what this class is about. And the title of the class is The 7 Elements of a Spiritual Person. And so before you give me any credit, this is not my own, well, actually, it's somewhat my invention, but it's based on a book by Andy Stanley and Stuart Hall called The 7 Checkpoints. And so you guys can get it on Amazon or christianbook.com. So I've retitled it The 7 Elements of a Spiritual Person, and I'm using some of the principles, actually, no, all of the principles that he talks about, and I'm fleshing it out with my own experience and different scriptures to build this class. And so you're probably going to feel challenged. I hope that's why you're here. You want to be challenged. You want to be pushed, and you're thinking. And that's really how you grow, right? That's really how you become mature. And so some of your established, what should I say, preconceived ideas may be pushed a bit, but that's how we grow. And so I will begin by saying that there is a direct correlation between knowledge and maturity. Okay, and I'm not just talking about any type of knowledge. I'm talking about knowledge of God. Okay, so there's a strong correlation between the knowledge of God and maturity. We get this idea in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 1, actually the first part of verse 1, Hebrews 6, the author says, "Therefore, let us move beyond the elementary teaching about Christ and be taken forward to maturity." Okay, so he's saying we're making a shift. We're moving from the elementary teachings onto maturity. So this idea of maturity being correlated with knowledge is mentioned also in the previous chapter, in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 14. He says solid food is for the mature, and he's making a reference to the scriptures, to the deep knowledge of God's truth. So there is this correlation between knowledge and maturity. And so to attain maturity, we have to grow in our knowledge. We have to grow, and not just, when I say knowledge, I don't just mean Bible knowledge in terms of passages and references. I mean understanding, a deeper understanding of God's word, a deeper understanding of the thoughts of God as revealed in the scriptures. Okay, so we get that knowledge. We have to grow in our knowledge. But it's not just about gaining knowledge, because in Hebrews 5, verse 14, listen to what he says. He says, solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. And so part one of going on to maturity is gaining that knowledge, but you can't stop there. Part two is applying that knowledge. And someone has actually defined wisdom as such. Wisdom is not just knowledge, but it's applied knowledge. So it's getting the knowledge and then allowing that knowledge to change your day-to-day. Okay, so practicing that knowledge, implementing that knowledge throughout your life. And so in other words, a mature person is someone who has the right knowledge about God and his ways, and has the character to do what? To apply that knowledge, to apply those principles in her life. And so someone who's got the right knowledge, but also someone who is able to apply these truths and these principles in her life. C.S. Lewis has a quote that I'm going to paraphrase. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's pretty deep. He says that he believes like we do in free will, right? God created us as free moral agents, meaning that we have free will. And C.S. Lewis says that the only free will you have is of who you become. He says, because first you make choices, and then the choices make you. He says that you decide who you become, and ultimately who you become decides what you do. Does that make sense? And so, for example, if I make unspiritual choices, if somebody makes unspiritual choices, that person will inevitably become an unspiritual person. And once you're an unspiritual person, you have no other choice but to make unspiritual choices. And so, how does this relate to maturity? The decisions we make today will help us become mature. And the more you become mature, the more you'll be able to make choices that facilitate that maturity. But conversely, on the opposite end, if we do not make spiritual choices, then we get to a place where we're immature. And because we're immature, we'll keep making decisions that continue to push us in that direction. Okay, so we'll talk about 7 steps or 7 elements or of a spiritually mature person. And so the first step is authentic faith. Okay, that's the first step, the first element. The second element is spiritual discipline. Hi, Dan. The second step is, now everyone knows that you're the one that just walked away in camera. But we're gracious because that's what mature people do. And we're all here to learn to be mature. And we're happy that you're here with us, Dan. Yeah. So we're talking about the 7 elements of spiritual maturity. The first one is authentic faith. The second one is spiritual discipline. The third one is moral boundaries. You don't have to get them all down. You'll have access to the notes, and it's being recorded if my phone doesn't die. So, and then the fourth one is healthy friendships. The fifth element is wise choices. The sixth element is ultimate authority. And the seventh element is putting others first. 7 elements of spiritual maturity. So today we're going to talk about authentic faith, not just faith, but authentic faith. So let's begin with a well-known passage in the scriptures on faith that defines faith. Okay? So we're not going to talk about all 7 of them tonight. Okay? We're just talking about one.
What's the third one?
The third one is moral boundaries. Moral boundaries.
Authentic faith, moral boundaries. Spiritual discipline.
Spiritual discipline, moral boundaries. But again, as I said, I can send you my notes. If you just want to listen tonight, feel free to do that. If you want to take notes, feel free to do that. But you can have access to the notes. And as I said, we have to record it. So, authentic faith. Let's begin with a passage in scripture that tells us a very specific definition of faith. You guys know which passage I'm talking about? Hebrews chapter 11. Okay, Hebrews chapter 11. It says, now faith, I'm reading from the New English Translation, so it may sound a little different than the NIV. It says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and being convinced of what we do not see. So what do you see in this passage here? What are the 2 supporting beams, if you will, the 2 pillars of faith as described in this verse? What do you guys think? And this can be interactive, yeah. Not a rhetorical question. I'm asking you what you think.
Hope being one.
Hope being one, okay, yeah. And what's the other one? I'll read it again. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and being convinced of what we do not see. So we have hope, the certainty of hope, and then what else? A conviction in what? In the invisible world. A conviction in what is not visible, what our senses do not give us. Now, when he talks about hope, what kind of hope is he talking about? Faith is being sure of what we hope for. Is he talking about that next promotion that you would like to have, or a job, or what is he talking about?
Hope we find in Christ.
Yes, he's talking about eternal hope. Okay, Christians have this anchor to hold on to, and that's eternal hope. He's saying faith, authentic faith, well, he didn't say authentic, I'm adding authentic. He's saying faith is being sure of your hope, trusting, knowing without a doubt, with certainty, that God has prepared a place for you. That's faith. And secondly, It's being convinced of what we do not see. In this context, what is it that we do not see? Being convinced of what we do not see.
The spiritual world around
The spiritual world around us. Heaven. Everything that has to do with God's promises in the spiritual world. We don't see God physically. We don't see the angels. We don't see the spiritual battle going on. We don't see the Holy Spirit, right? We haven't seen the risen Christ. We've heard of it. We've believed it. We've seen it with our hearts, but we haven't seen it with our physical senses. And so there is a whole spiritual and visible reality that we Christians believe in that the person sitting on the train next to you maybe doesn't believe in. The student sitting next to you in class, your co-worker, right? Maybe doesn't believe in. And so the Bible is saying faith is having that certainty of the hope that you hold and that conviction that there is an invisible world and that we're part of this sphere, this spiritual sphere. Okay? Another passage on faith in Hebrews 11, verse 6. He says, the author says, now without faith, it is impossible to please God. For the one who approaches God must believe that he, which God exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. So what do we learn in this passage? I'm going to get a sip of my coffee. What do we learn in this passage?
that we need faith to please God.
Say that again, Janea?
We need faith to please God.
Okay, we need faith to please God. This is very emphatic. There's no ambiguity in his language. He's saying without faith, if you don't have faith, it is impossible to please God. Abraham was called the father of faith. Faith is the ticket. Faith is what gets us in. Not our own righteousness, not our own personal efforts. Faith is the essential. Faith is the engine. If you don't have faith, we cannot even begin to please God. That's what he's saying. Saying faith is super, super important. We cannot get around not having faith. We have to have faith. Okay? Faith, it's impossible to please him without faith, because for the one who approaches him must believe that God exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. Do you guys see the same themes as in the first verse? So we must believe, even though we do not see him, right? Some of you have heard his voice. Okay? You can't discount that. Some people say, well, they've heard God's voice. I've never heard his voice, audibly. But he's saying we believe that he exists, even though we've not seen him. And we believe what else? Not just that he exists, but what else? That he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And what quality does that imply God has? That he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Just that he rewards. What quality does that imply? That we can trust him, that he's trustworthy, that he's just, that he's fair, that he's trustworthy. Okay? And so, again, the Bible is saying without that kind of faith, that God is real, that God exists, and that God is trustworthy, you can rely on him, you can trust him, it's impossible to please God. And so here's the principle of authentic faith. Authentic faith is the conviction that God can be trusted, that God is a sure repose, a sure assurance. You can rely on him. He's dependable. That's the principle of authentic faith. That God can be trusted and that God will deliver on his promises. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about, well, I should ask you guys, if we're saying that God can be trusted and that God will deliver on his promises, what should your question be? What should be our question when we hear this? That God can be trusted and he will deliver on his promises. What should the next question be?
what will he actually deliver? Like what
Exactly. What are we talking about? What are his promises? What promises will he deliver on? And so what I'd like to do, I'm going to give you guys a few passages, and for time's sake, I'd like some volunteers to read those passages in rapid succession, and then we'll talk about them. Okay, so I have two sets of passages. The first one is Genesis 15, verse 5. So who can read that? Georgia can read that. So Genesis 15, verse 5, Georgia. The second one is Joshua chapter 1, 3 to 5. Okay, Kay can read that, Joshua 1, 3 to 5. And then the third one is Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Can you read that, Janaea? Okay, great. And then the next passage, we'll start with you, Larissa, if you don't mind, is Matthew 28, verse 20. Okay, and then the next one is John 14, 1 to 3. Dan, if you can read that one. And then Randy, if you can read 1 Corinthians 10, 13. And then Alexi, you can read Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. Okay? Everyone knows what they're reading? Okay, so we'll start with you, Georgia.
Okay. Genesis 15:5. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be.
All right, great. And then Kay?
So Joshua 1, 3 to 5. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you.
Awesome. Janaea, Jeremiah 29, verse 11.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future.
Excellent. So this is one set of scriptures or promises, right? And so we'll begin with another set. Go ahead, Larissa, Matthew 28, verse 20.
And then teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of it.
Excellent. Dan?
John 14:1-3. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am.
Excellent. Randy?
1 Corinthians 10:13. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure.
Excellent. Alexi?
Your conduct must be free from the love of money, and you must be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you, and I will never abandon you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, and I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?
Wonderful. So what do all these passages have in common? They're all promises. Everyone gets that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a difference between these two set of promises? The ones that our sisters over there read and the ones that you guys read over here. Is there a difference between these two sets of promises? Okay.
I mean, I would think so until Alexi read what he read.
Okay.
Because I would think that these three are specifically to, like, they're directed at certain people, whereas these ones are more general, except for I feel like Alexi quoted the one that I read.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Okay.
does that change things?
Interesting. Let's talk about that. So one major difference that Kay noted between the different passages we read is that some of these passages were specifically directed towards certain individuals. Does everyone see that? Mm-hmm. So we'll come back to your point, but let's talk about that first of all. Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, the passage that Georgia read. Who is speaking in that passage? God is speaking. And who is God speaking to? Abraham. And what is the promise? What does the promise entail?
His offspring.
His offspring. That Abraham would become the father of all nations. Okay? So everyone sees that that promise applied to Abraham. You can't be a Christian and not have any children, right? We know many Christians who don't have children. And so that promise applies to Abraham, not to us. The Joshua promise, 1:3-5, that Kay read, that God would give Joshua every piece of land that he sets his foot on, was right before the conquest of Canaan. And so we all understand that that promise applies to Joshua and the Israelites, correct? How about the Jeremiah 29 verse 11 promise? Who's speaking in that passage? Well, no, who is speaking? God, through the prophet Jeremiah. And who is God speaking to?
Or in exile.
Because they were in exile.
Right.
Because the previous verse says that after 70 years in exile, God would bring him back, and God is expressing his heart for those people, that he does have a plan for them, and that he does have a future, even though they may feel that he's abandoned them, but he still wants to bless them. Okay? Do those passages apply to us directly? No, they do not apply to us directly. So, how can this affect our faith if we hold on to a promise that we mistakenly think applies to us? How can that affect our faith? Or can that affect somebody's faith? If you hold on to a promise that God did make to you, right? How can that affect your faith negatively?
Well, you expect something that doesn't come to pass, and so then you assume God is not trustworthy.
Right, right. That's exactly it. If you put your faith in a God who's made a promise to you and he doesn't deliver on that promise, then you can easily assume that God is not trustworthy. God doesn't love me, or God is not able to do what he said he would do. And that's really the root of authentic faith. It's being able to believe and to trust that God is who he is and that God can do what he said he would do. But it's only when his promise applies to us directly. And so in the passages, let's go through the passages that that side of the room read. And so the passage in Matthew 28:20, what does that passage say? Who was talking in that passage? Jesus. And he was talking to the disciples, the 11 disciples on the mountain. And what is he telling them? To go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always. Now, someone could argue and say, well, wait, he's talking based on the same principle of interpretation. He's talking to the 11 disciples. Does that really apply to us? What do you guys think?
Well, he's talking to disciples.
That's right.
Who claim to be a disciple.
That's right. That's right. He's not talking to a specific individual. He's talking to the body of disciples who were going to make more disciples. And so this promise applies to all disciples. As long as we are within his will, we're making disciples. He's going to be with us. How about the passage in John 14:1-3? Same thing. He's talking about the hope of heaven, eternal mansions that is prepared for his followers. So does that apply to us? Yes. How about the 1 Corinthians 10:13? Does that apply to us? Yeah, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and reminding them that no matter what challenges you're going through, no matter what obstacles you're facing, no matter what temptation you're going through, God is faithful. He's going to be with you. He won't let you tempt it beyond what you can endure, and he'll provide a way out. Does that apply to us? Yes. How about the Hebrews 13, verse 5 and 6? So who's speaking in this passage? Yes, that's a safe answer. Because we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. So it's God. God speaking through a disciple, a messenger. We don't know who it is. Theologians have not been able to nail that one down. And so he's talking to the church, to Christians. And let's read it again. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? And so here, is he talking about a specific promise to someone specific? No, he's talking about to all Christians. And even though the author of Hebrews is quoting the Old Testament, and this is a promise that God had made to his people, Israel, but the principle is if we are his people, he will be with us. Okay? He will take care of us. We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to worry. And here's the thing. A lot of promises in the Old Testament, there's a principle behind that promise that you can find in the New Testament. But there are a lot of promises also that are very specific, and you cannot take those promises as applicable to you. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's so many churches today, and there's so many spiritual, quote unquote, leaders who are using passages to teach people promises of God that do not directly apply to us. There's a very famous book that came out a few years back called The Prayer of Jabez. And it's a short prayer that you find in the Bible. I don't even remember where it is. I think in Numbers. And the author took that prayer and he deconstructed that prayer and told people, stop praying that prayer. And in the same way, God answered Jabez as if the words of Jabez had it was a magical formula that he. So it's really setting yourself up for disappointment to latch on to promises that God has not made to you. Okay? So everybody clear on that? And so the question, do all biblical promises apply to you? The answer is no. Not all biblical promises apply to us. So what does God promise us as Christians? That he'll be with us, that we have eternal mansions waiting for us, that he will not let us be tempted beyond what we can bear, that if we hold on to him, he will protect us, he will be with us, and he will provide for us. There's one more promise I'd like us to look at, and that's in Matthew 21, verse 21. Matthew 21, verse 21. Okay, so this one, because this promise can be tricky also, I know that I've wrestled with it over the years. Matthew 21, verse 21. So, Jesus replied, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. How many times have you read this passage? Many times, right? Has it come true in every sense of your of the promise? And so maybe we need to spend some time thinking about this, because Jesus is not a liar, right? God is that's the nature of God. Jesus is God incarnate. Jesus has to be trusted. God has to be trusted. And here he says, whatever you ask for with faith, you will receive. And that's where we have to understand that implicitly there have to be conditions to that kind of a promise. Because if I pray with faith for the death of my enemy, if I pray with faith that, I don't know, that Donald Trump doesn't get elected, if I pray with faith that, I walk out today and I'll find $2 million and in a plastic bag in front of the entrance of the church, right? There has to be conditions. So maybe we go back to the context. So who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to the apostles, right? He was coming back from Jerusalem. He was hungry. He saw the fig tree from a distance. It appeared to have fruit because it had leaves, but it did not have fruit. Jesus cursed the fig tree. We won't get into why. Some people said he lost his temper. Others said that it was allegorical because the Pharisees had the external appearance of having fruit, but they didn't have fruit. And so Jesus cursed the fig tree to show the disciples that it's not good to appear to have fruit and not have fruit. So people have said many things about this passage. The truth is, we don't know. We don't know why he cursed the fig tree. Okay? But the disciples were astonished by the power of faith and action. And Jesus said, guys, if you have faith, you will do that too. If you have faith, you can tell this mountain to move and it will move. And so here's the question. Did any of the apostles ever exercise that kind of faith? No, they didn't move mountains, did they?
No.
Okay, right? Is that even physically possible? They never moved any mountains, and yet they were able to raise the dead. They were able to heal people. They were able to do amazing things. And one could argue that collectively as a church, they did more miracles than Jesus did. Okay? And so that promise applies to us, but there has to be conditions to that promise. What are the conditions to that promise? I believe that, first of all, Jesus was talking to a kind of person we need to be as Christians. He was telling the disciples, you have to be the kind of person that have great faith. And to be that kind of person, one, you have to understand who God is, that nothing is impossible for God. And if what you ask for is aligned with God's will, then it will be done. Because the faith is not it's not faith in your own power, it's faith in the power of God. So it's not like faith gives you personal power. It's always the power of God. Faith just opens the door for God to work through you. But you never really have, the power never emanates from you. It's not you who have the power. It's God who has the power. And so your lack of faith can keep God from working, just like your faith can open the door for God to work. And so I believe Jesus was telling the apostles, as he's telling us today, what kind of people are we? Are we the kind of people who understand God? We understand that God can do anything. Are we the kind of people who are on a mission for God and know that God can operate in any way he wants to help us in this mission? Are we the kind of people who will not use that power that faith provides us, that power that God works through us, in a self-serving way? We've never seen in the scriptures Jesus using his power for himself. Unless you consider when he cursed the fig tree, or when he took the coin from the fish's mouth, when Peter, unless you consider those things. But he never used his own power for himself. In fact, as you read the apostles' journey in the book of Acts, they never used God's power for themselves. Never. And so those have to be implicit conditions to this prayer. Whatever we ask for, God will do. But first of all, the person asking must be someone who understands God, someone who's aligned with God and his mission, and someone who's not self-serving. Do you guys see how the evangelical world and the religious world today have completely missed that out? And faith is proclaimed as a how do you say that in English? A passport too, like a key that can open any door. Hey, you want a job? If you don't get it, that's because you don't have faith. You want a husband? You want a wife? Somebody's sick? If you don't get what you want, it's simply because you don't have faith. And that's not what Jesus is saying here. Okay? So authentic faith is the kind of faith that is kingdom centered. You see Paul in prison, and Paul doesn't pray to get out of prison. You see Paul sick, and he doesn't pray to be healed. You see Paul being beaten, being flogged, You see him being led to go to jail, and he doesn't pray to, hey, God, make me disappear. And so the prayer of faith is not a prayer that is self-centered. It's a prayer that is kingdom-centered. So I'd like to end with this idea that faith, and this is something I learned the hard way, but faith has two sides. Authentic faith has two sides. There is the one side that believes that God can do anything. And I'll quote the scripture in James chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, where James says that Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed that it wouldn't rain for 3 years, and God stopped the rain in Israel for 3 years. Again, it wasn't a selfish prayer. It wasn't a self-serving prayer. It was a kingdom-focused prayer. It was to convict Ahab, who was king of Israel, and bring God's justice to the kingdom. Okay? So authentic faith is having that kind of gutso, that kind of it's almost it's a wild spirit that believes anything is possible for God. So that's the first side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the ability to trust God when he does not work according to your expectations. And we see Jesus doing that when he's in the garden. We see Paul doing that with his thorn in the flesh. And so I've learned, and I'm still learning, to balance those two sides of faith. On the one hand, to believe that God can do anything. On the other hand, to trust him that when he doesn't do something, he's still working for the good of his church and for my good as his child. And so authentic faith is trusting that God is who he says he is, and that God will deliver on his promises, that he will do what he said, what he promised he would do. I'd like to close with this last passage in Proverbs chapter 3. In Proverbs chapter 3, Proverbs 3 verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. And the idea here again is authentic faith is that person who does not rely on himself, but relies on God. The word trust here literally means physically leaning on somebody. It means relying on that person for everything in life. Just trusting that God is going to sustain me and be with me. And so I would like us to answer the following questions. And so we'll take a few minutes in small groups to discuss. So we're 9, so we can do 3 groups of 3. I remember my timetable. And I'd like to ask you guys to do some soul searching tonight as we end the class and think about those questions. 1, what promises has God kept in your life? What is a promise, or what are promises that you feel God has kept in your own life? And then secondly, what promises do you feel God has not kept in your life? So what promises do you feel that God has kept? And what promise do you feel that God has not kept? And thirdly, how is your view of God affected by the world? How is your view of God affected by the world around us? And when I mean the world, I mean the thoughts and philosophies and trends and the way people think about God. How do views in the world affect your own view of God? And what do you need to change? Based on what we heard tonight, what do you feel like you need to change in your view of God? Does that make sense? So promises that God has kept in your life, promises that you feel he has not kept, how your view of God is affected by the world, And what do you need to change in your view of God?